point is with the critical race theory, it's built into the ideology that if you disagree with it, that's just your white fragility. That's you're being defensive. You don't want to...
In denial.
Yes, you're in denial. You don't want to open up. This ideology and this idea that feelings are truth has taken over the mental health profession so that you now can't treat people properly. Again, this term anti-racism, if you disagree, if you say, well, I'm not racist, but I express my not being racist in a different way, there can be no different expression of it. If you're not an anti-racist, then you're a racist.
Welcome to Parallax Views, a IEA series of conversations about the politics of culture with specific focus on freedom of speech. My name is Marc Glendening, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Amy Gallagher, who is going to talk about her legal action supported by the Bad Law Project against the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust. So Amy's story is a very fascinating one because it's from within the public sector. It's an illumination, really, of what is taking place, a very sinister development within our society. Amy, would you start by telling us how you came to be in the situation you are now in? What were the kind of stages? Yes,
there's been lots of stages. Thank you for having me. So I first did a degree in English literature, and then I went into nursing, and I went particularly into mental health nursing, and I decided to train to become a psychotherapist. So I did my first 2 years at the Tavistock. I should say when I did my first 2 years, it didn't have the kind of reputation it has now, and the gender identity clinic was very separate. So at the time, I thought I was going into quite a well-renowned institution that was held in high esteem. And my first 2 years was fine, and then I went back to complete my training because my training to be a psychotherapist is a 4-year-long training. And that was in 2020 when I returned. And then quite soon after that, there was, I remember this was after sort of Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd, there was a very highly politicised environment there from the get-go, really. So to begin with, I was asked to attend a lecture on race and racism. Now, I assumed this would be kind of the psychological research into racism or kind of psychotherapeutic kind of theories. It wasn't any of that. It was just kind of stuff about Black Lives Matter. And it was quoting critical race theorists. And the ideas were highly politicised and highly ideological. And there was a thread running all the way through it that essentially Western civilization and Christianity were to blame. And I was just kind of like, what is this? And at the end, there was a time for question and answers. And I just sort of challenged, I sort of said, yeah, I'm noting that you're talking about Christianity in quite a negative way. And she said, well, Christianity is racist because it's European. So I was okay. I just sort of said, I
think it kicked off in the Middle East, didn't it? But I mean,
we can get onto that later, but there's this weird conflation of Western and whiteness and European all gets conflated into one. So yeah, and then about 3 days after that lecture, I got sent a lecture that was titled A Policy Seminar, and it was highly publicised throughout the Trust, called Whiteness, a Problem for Our Time. And when I looked onto the website, it was saying things like whiteness and racism are the same thing, and racism is a problem for white people. And then I watched this lecture, and it was just an hour of critical race theory. And I was really concerned because this isn't just an academic theory that's being taught among other theories. This is a clinical training to work as a clinician in the NHS, and this was being given by a clinician, and it was being presented as sort of fact, essentially. It wasn't kind of, this is a theory, here's the positives about it, here's the negatives, you know. So I responded to that and I said, no, I personally don't think being white is a problem, and I think we need to understand that lots of people, there's a range of views about these, you know, about race and society, and we need to be aware, because we could be treating patients with a range of views, and not everyone sees the world in this way. And after that, I got pulled into a meeting, and I was essentially told that this course might not be right for me because my views weren't sufficiently anti-racist, essentially. So there's now this idea of anti-racism, which is all across our institutions at the moment, and I've looked into it, especially across clinical psychology courses all across the country, that teaches this idea of anti-racism, which is it's not what it says on the tin. It's actually very...
it's profoundly racist.
Yes, it is.
Well, we'll come back to that in a moment, because that leads on to the sort of second question I want to ask you, really, which is about the intellectual content of this. But in terms of your personal experience, what I found very incredibly sinister was that they then got in touch with your professional body, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and essentially really tried to get you sacked, which is really kind of McCarthyite kind of practice in a different context.
Yeah, so I was accused of... So this is all I've done throughout the whole 2 years. My crime is essentially disagreeing with critical race theory and not accepting it. I've never said anything overtly discriminatory myself. I've just said I disagree with Robin DiAngelo's white fragility. I disagree that we live in a white supremacist society. So when they contacted my nursing profession, they accused me of causing race-based trauma, leading a campaign of hate, saying that I'd made people feel unsafe, all sorts of things. And I don't know, just for criticising it or not agreeing with it. So yeah, I mean, it's been pretty rough, but I've had a student conduct policy raised against me because I said that Robin DiAngelo is not a clinician and she's not evidence-based. And why?
Which is empirically true.
True, yeah. But they experience it as an attack and it hurts their feelings. So therefore I've done something wrong. So it's it's been a really difficult 2 years, but I've been told that I need to become more anti-racist, and I need to there's been questions around whether I can work with diverse patients. I presume they mean patients of a different race or ethnicity. I think that's what they mean. But it's been you cannot challenge you can't challenge the ideology, because I think what I've experienced when I challenge it and I respond to it with logic, they can't respond back because they don't have a logical response. So they just say, you've traumatised us. I've been accused of traumatising people, all sorts of things. It's been like a Kafka nightmare. It's been, Yeah,
I mean, sort of 2 points come to mind following what you've been saying. I mean, the first is, it seems to me there is a case here, isn't there, for pursuing them for libel, because they have communicated to your professional body very, very heavy allegations, which, if the professional body were to accept them, would mean that you couldn't carry on as a nurse, let alone qualified to be a psychotherapist. So it seems to me that that's a very important thing in relation to this. But secondly, what sort of intrigues me about your story is that, I mean, when I was growing up, authoritarians who wanted to censor what we could see and hear and say were pretty overt about it. They were pretty honest about it. They said, well, we think that what you're wanting to publish, or, they wanted to ban television programs or plays because they thought they were blasphemous or something like that. But they were pretty direct and honest about it. What's interesting about your story is that there's this kind of nightmarish Orwellian sort of doublespeak whereby they're accusing you of having traumatized them. So they're presenting themselves as being victims, even though they're in positions of authority relative to you within that institution, simply because you've expressed in a very temperate way. I mean, you come across as a rather temperate person. I don't see you as a sort of great bombastic sort of potential dictator. So the notion that these quite experienced, one assumes, academics or whatever they are, clinicians, would be traumatized. They may disagree with you, which is fair enough, but I mean, to actually be, I mean, this is kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, it adds a different...
It's really absurd, I mean, it's a complete misuse of kind of psychological terms like trauma. trauma isn't somebody disagreeing with you or presenting a different view. But I think they have been so long never been challenged that it's like, for them it probably is like trauma, because they're
maybe yes.
Maybe it is. They're so unused to it.
Yeah.
And I don't think they've themselves ever challenged their own ideas. And if someone presents you with an idea, actually you might not have the full truth, maybe there's something you haven't looked at or thought about, I think they do experience it as an attack, but the point is it's not. That's their subjective feelings. But we're living in an age now where there's a conflation between feelings and truth. I think if they feel things, they think that that's some kind of authority, but it's not.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, that plays into questions of postmodernism, which is one of my obsessions. And you see this anti-rationalist mindset now having a grip on the society, which is incredibly dangerous, because then if you get politics and professional practice dictated by very subjective, arbitrary feelings, then in fact you're on some sort of slippery slope, it seems to me, towards a very illiberal kind of society, because we can all have feelings that we feel are offended, but if we're given license to take action against other people on that basis, then, where does this end?
Yeah, I mean, and for me as a mental health practitioner, I work with people's feelings all the time. People feel strong feelings. I usually work with people who feel things very strongly and struggle to not act on those feelings, or people that cut themselves off from their feelings. And I try to kind of get the middle ground with people. And I'm trying to get people to think objectively about their feelings. That, okay, you're feeling this strong anger, you're feeling this, that you need to do this particular behaviour or harm yourself or whatever, but let's step back and try to think about it, that the feeling will pass, and there's ways of managing it and coping with it. So that's kind of what I do. That's part of my job, is trying to help people to not be totally dictated by their feelings and to be able to step back and think. But now this ideology and this idea that feelings are truth has taken over the mental health profession, so that you now can't treat people properly, because actually you're getting mixed messages about how we manage feelings and what we do about, so it's a very bizarre situation where mental health institutions and the profession in general is now teaching a kind of hypersensitivity and a kind of overthinking that I would ordinarily be trying to reduce in people. So yes.
Yeah, extraordinary, and also very disturbing.
Yes.
Going back to the content of Whiteness, a Problem for Our Time, the lecture you attended, I don't know if you say a bit about that, because it seems to me there's a sort of parallel with fascistic thinking here, in that qualities of good and bad, malign and decent, are attributed to entire groups of people, and so that we become little more than kind of avatars of bigger groups, which are assigned positive or negative attributes. I mean, do you think there's an element of that with this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, throughout this lecture, they're using phrases like white ignorance, white fragility, white privilege. Now, from my perspective, certainly in a clinical setting, terms like ignorance or fragility shouldn't be being attached to any race or group. They're not related to race or ethnicity. You can accuse somebody of being ignorant, but it shouldn't be being attached to their skin colour or race. There's no link between those two things. And the statements that they're making, essentially, which they're saying that all white people are racist, which I challenged. I said, is this the view of this lecturer, or is this the view of the trust? They confirmed that it was the view of the trust. And she said, it was explained to me that, well, we're not saying all white people act in a racist way, but they're all unconsciously racist. And I said, but you are still making a negative generalisation about the minds of a group of people. The unconscious is in the mind, so you're still saying that white people are inherently prejudiced in a way that other groups aren't. And that's racist, because you're making a generalisation about a group of people based on their skin tone. But they just believe this so strongly, and the point is with the critical race theory, it's built into the ideology that if you disagree with it, that's just your white fragility. That's you're being defensive. You don't want to...
denial.
Yes, you're in denial. You don't want to open up. I've been told that I need to essentially do more learning. It's a failure of my understanding to not take on these ideas. So there's no way, basically it kind of shields itself from any disagreement, which is how authoritarian, totalitarian ideas work. There can be no nuance or leeway or kind of, well, this is one view, but this is another. This is the line, and if you disagree with it, it's you're being defensive and there's an issue with you. And this is kind of all or nothing thinking, as you say. It's very authoritarian, and it's essentially, when you get down to it, if you look into this stuff more deeply and I've been told I need to interrogate whiteness. If you look at the literature and you see what they mean by whiteness, it says they relate it to all sorts of things, but there is this idea of whiteness is property. So
whiteness
is property.
Right.
Whiteness is essentially, they say whiteness is being on time, whiteness is meritocracy, whiteness is capitalism, whiteness is property.
as in private property?
Yes.
I see, not an essence of self.
No, like a private property.
I see, right.
So then you realise that this is actually not about race at all. It's about it's communist fundamentally. That is what it is. But they've sort of switched the terms around, basically.
That's very interesting, because I was talking to Helen Joyce recently about transgenderism. And we were discussing the possibility that the transgender militant activists are using the whole concept of transgenderism not in order to try and establish particular rights, whether, rightly or wrongly, but particular legal rights into a particular very small set of individuals, but really as an ideological vehicle to try and transform the whole of society. So it's not about piecemeal, limited reform. It's a part of a kind of more generalized rejection of the entirety of the society and a desire for sort of very radical transformation, which isn't really spelt out as to what this ultimately will lead to, unlike, socialist revolution or fascist revolution. Are quite clear what those kind of movements were trying to achieve in getting past sort of liberal bourgeois society as they would have seen it. So it seems to me it's very interesting what you're saying, that this is really the same kind of thing, because I think you at one point challenged them and said, well, I'm obviously not a racist, I'm colourblind. And they say, but colourblindness is also a form of racism, implying that simply wanting to treat people equally in law and medical practice and what have you on the basis of their individuality is not really enough. They're wanting something else.
They said that that's discredited, that idea. So now they're essentially saying if you're not constantly aware of race all the time, then that somehow means you're not being a good anti-racist. To be a good anti-racist is to be always hyper aware of your race and other people's race. Now, see, the thing is with that, it very quickly becomes or kind of is racism, because you're fixating on race. You're having this hyper awareness of people's skin colours or skin tone or ethnicity, and naturally that would lead you to treat people differently. So it's very bizarre. They've kind of inverted the term racism, essentially. And again, this term anti-racism, if you disagree, if you say, well, I'm not racist, but I express my not being racist in a different way, there can be no different expression of it. If you're not an anti-racist, then you're a racist, basically. So if you don't say exactly what we think, then you're a racist. That's how it works.
But what is it, both in general but also in relation to psychotherapy, they want to see then? I don't quite understand. I can understand a course saying, you must treat your clients, with great regard, you must be sensitive to them, you mustn't be prejudiced against them because or make assumptions about them because of, you know, some characteristic they have. But I don't quite understand how this ideology fits in with how you as a practitioner would
so essentially
interact with your
what
client.
they're saying is, as a practitioner, I've got to do the opposite of what you described and the opposite of what I've ordinarily been taught, which is to not be prejudiced and to not have assumptions and to not make judgments. But actually I've got to go in with judgments and with assumptions, and I've got to assume, for example, if I had a black or an Asian patient, that they would feel threatened by the fact that I'm white, that there's a hierarchy, that I'm a kind of an oppressor and they're oppressed, and I've got to think about how that would affect them. Now, this is all a narrative, and this is all a kind of, as you say, a judgment, an assumption that you're bringing into the room, which to me goes against the ethics of non-judgmental practice, because I'm coming in there with an agenda, and I'm coming in, you know, I've got to sort of see people as either oppressors or oppressed or victims, or whereas actually you don't know what a person thinks or feels about anything until they tell you. And
presumably they're there, you know,
for other reasons,
voluntarily, and they're wanting to see you. But in that case, then, so you're going in to the room as a white oppressor, let us assume, according to the theory. You're dealing with a client who just so happens to have a different skin tone and ethnicity. What are you then meant to say to that person in relation to the problems they have come to you to try and have addressed? I still don't get it.
No, I don't get it. This is where I don't think they understand it either, because they say you've got to sort of factor in the fact that you're an oppressor, but they don't quite say how that would happen in the kind of therapy session. Essentially, you know, I mean, I had an experience there where they were talking about this idea you've got to interrogate your whiteness and be aware of your whiteness. And someone who was genuinely trying to understand said, well, what does that mean? What do I actually have to do? How do I actually do that? And they didn't really have an answer. They just said, you've just got to sort of think about it. You've got to just, I don't know, you've got to sort of feel guilt and shame about your, I don't know. They don't know either.
And that's extraordinary, because I mean, you're paying to be on this course. So these are courses that purport to be equipping you to become a psychotherapist, and presumably to pass some sort of exam. So they're giving you these lectures, but there's no kind of punchline in terms of how this relates to what you actually do. No,
there's just this idea that there's this overarching kind of white supremacy, whiteness in the air, and you've just got to be aware of that and, you know, challenge it wherever you can. And I don't quite know what that means, or you know, what that means in practical terms. But you can't challenge it. You can't say I disagree.
Yeah, I mean, it's very sort of Frankfurt School, isn't it?
Yes,
it's a sort of updating of Frankfurt School theory, because the whole, you know, basis of the Frankfurt School was critical theory. So they sort of abandoned articulating a positive case for socialist revolution because they thought that was impossible, or came to see that as impossible. And so they then sort of took left-wing ideas in a totally different direction, incorporating, interestingly,
I think it's
psychological or psychotherapeutic ideas. I mean, do you see a connection?
Yeah, I do, because what happened was, so Marxism was about, it had this kind of oppressor-oppressed dynamic, but it was out in the world in economics. So you could look at it in material terms. This person's got this amount of wealth, this person doesn't have enough. Then obviously with capitalism we saw that actually it helped the working class to have better material conditions. So you can say, well, actually, hang on, capitalism has worked, it's helped improve people's living standards overall, so we don't need we don't need Marxism anymore. Marx was wrong. Now, what happened with the Frankfurt School is they essentially took the oppressor-oppressed dynamic but put it into people's sort of heads. So they made it psychological rather than outside in the world where we could look and say, actually, this doesn't work. The thing is with that, it becomes totally unfalsifiable, because you're essentially saying it's your identity. You live in a sort of patriarchal capitalist white supremacist system of oppression, and it's all around you, and it influences you psychologically. It influences how you see yourself, it influences how you see other people. So they kind of moved it from the external world via psychology back into the mind, and it's so difficult to challenge because you can't have like I said, it's totally unfalsifiable. How can I prove whether I'm influenced by patriarchy or not? How can what are we even talking about? Whereas at least with economics, you can look at...
Yeah, there was a material reality they were pointing to in a whole theory.
Exactly.
Which you may or may not agree with, but at least
so now,
they were engaged with the objective world. Whereas this is the problem with transgenderism and critical race theory and all these other offshoots of critical theory, is that they're almost sort of, it seems to me, kind of updating of ideas of witchcraft. They're ineffable, mysterious forces in the same way that, some early Christians would have sort of claimed existed.
I mean, so what critical race theory says is essentially that racism is the fundamental orientating principle of Western civilization. It's in all of our structures, it's in all of our systems, and there's no evidence. I don't know how they're proving this or disproving. It's just there. So, how would you solve that problem? How would you solve that? I mean, other than tearing down every system or structure, and it's not even clear that that would solve the problem. So it's
because it's not unlike socialist revolutionary. They're not suggesting what the alternative would be.
No, exactly. It's just there.
Who's going to run the Tavistock Clinic? Who are going to conduct?
It's just this endless thing where there's this endless kind of revolution that doesn't ever solve anything, and you've just got to be aware of it. And I don't know. It hasn't worked itself out. It doesn't.
It doesn't sound surprising to me that they're quite keen to limit people like you and others from challenging it intellectually, because your lecturers didn't seem capable, or let alone willing, to defend it. No. Whereas, a good classical Marxist would say, yeah, come on, bring it on, let's have the debate. These people don't. They're trying to shut down debate, which suggests to me they're actually frightened of debate and intellectual interrogation, contestation, in the same way somebody's saying, well, the devil's all around us, and they couldn't really justify that, so they ended up, hanging women as witches and what have you, or some other form of
it's a belief. It's a belief. It is a belief that there's this thing all around us, and if you challenge it, you're a heretic. That's essentially. It's not a logical. It's not like you said with Marxists, you could have a logical maybe back and forth, but this isn't working from the basis of logic. So you're challenging someone's belief and their faith, and that's you're committing blasphemy basically. That is how this works. It's kind of like a theology rather than an economic theory. It's much more along those lines. And they, I think they would largely describe themselves as not being religious. This is the irony. Essentially, they've attacked Christianity, they attack religion more generally, but they are the most kind of religiously fundamentalist group of people I've come across, where in terms of the way that they're acting. So it's quite something to witness. It does feel, and from the perspective of someone who's interested in psychology, I do feel like I'm witnessing a kind of a group delusion almost, or a group think certainly, but they can't see it, which is
I mean, it does have, in addition to the analogy with sort of old style, Inquisition style religion. I mean, it has overtones here also of the kind of mad hysteria of, culture year zero and Maoism and the Khmer Rouge, and it has that fanaticism, which does sound, I know, perhaps exaggerated and a bit mad in the context of Britain and the West today, because the atmospherics are so different. And yet at the same time, when you hear that people are losing their jobs, being visited by the police because they've said something totally legal on the internet, they've got into some sort of debate, and then the police turn up to say, we're checking on your thinking, we're observing you because of the positions you have come out with, and so on and so forth, or school kids being threatened, as I've heard, by their teachers. There's something sort of in the air, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe we're in the early stages of a real transition to a fully authoritarian type of society if these trends just continue over the 20 or 30 years. I mean, do you think that's possible, or do you think there's going to be some sort of kickback?
I'm hopeful. I think it could go in that direction, but I think especially now where it's so easy for people to talk, especially and communicate and meet up via the internet, I think that it makes it makes pushback a lot easier. You know, for me, the fact that I've been able to crowdfund for legal fees and be able to connect with people and fight back, you know, that would have been harder, you know, several years ago, you know, 10 or 20 years ago. But there's ways of doing that now, so that's positive. It's much easier to get your message out there, even if you don't have the means ordinarily to do so. But I think your point about it being Maoist, it does feel like that. I know people say it's an exaggeration, but it does feel like a struggle session to be told that you've got to interrogate your whiteness. We're not going to tell you what that actually involves, but you've got to essentially feel guilt and shame about yourself. And if you don't, you're being defensive. So you've got to kind of just go through this sort of psychological interrogation of yourself. It does have echoes of kind of that kind of Soviet or a Maoist kind of, you know, psychological
There's
struggle.
a kind of hysteria, isn't
Yes.
there? So, and it's also sort of contrived hysteria, you know, like the Cultural Revolution. But I mean, you were even told, weren't you, that to stay away physically from the Tavistock because just your presence would be intimidating people because you'd once knocked on a door or something.
Yeah.
So tell us about that before we come on to the specifics of the Bad Law Project.
So one of the lecturers gave a speech. We were doing our seminars over Zoom because of the pandemic, and we were due to meet in person, and one of the lecturers gave a speech to the students to say she decided that we won't be meeting in person because my hate speech was better managed over Zoom. No, my hate speech.
I love the term also managed.
Managed.
You had to be sort of like Hannibal Lecter, you know, being transferred from one psychological secure unit to another. You had to be sort of strapped up, and you know, I mean, it's kind of hilarious. You have to be managed. What does that mean?
I don't know, but that they could, you know, I don't know, mute me if I said that I don't agree with Robin D'Angelo.
Oh, I see. They can mute, of course.
Yes, they
muting.
can.
Yes.
Yeah, they could. I don't know, block me or whatever. But there was an experience I had where I was in a session with a patient, and there was a noise going on that was interrupting our session. I left the room briefly to see where the noise was coming from, and I knocked on a door and asked if the noise could be lowered, and I was later accused of traumatising the people in the room.
Well, it must have been traumatising.
It must have, and I was told that I can't be in the reception area at a certain time because people would be re-traumatised by the sight of me. So the hysteria, it's become insane. I mean, they don't know what...
It sounds like some of these people may need a little bit of therapy themselves, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there is a very real phenomena of people who have their own psychological issues that we share going into that profession. I think.
Well, clearly.
Yes.
In conclusion, can you tell us a bit about what you're, actually doing, and how people who want to support you can support you, and because you've teamed up now with the Bad Law Project. So tell us all about that.
Yeah, so the Bad Law Project is run by Harry Miller and Lawrence Fox, and they've got some barristers that work with them. They've been really helpful in supporting me with my case and getting me publicity and helping with my crowdfund. So they're a really great organisation to go to for it. They've given me lots of advice, but they've really helped me to get my message out there. So essentially, what I'm doing is I'm still exploring my legal options. So watch this space. But all I can say now is I've brought a lawsuit against the trust. The charges that I'm bringing against them are racial discrimination, religious discrimination, and discrimination on the basis of philosophical beliefs, and my belief in not judging a person by the colour of their skin, which they've said is discredited, and various other things, victimisation and all sorts. But as you said at the beginning, what's quite significant about this is there hasn't been much legal pushback against critical race theory in the UK. There has it elsewhere. in America, it's got a lot of
It
attention.
was a big case, wasn't it, in Virginia?
Yes, there's been a few cases, but these ideas are now come through to the UK. I don't know how aware people are, but these ideas of white fragility and white privilege are being taught in universities, in training, NHS training courses, secondary schools.
The police,
the civil service.
the College of Policing is very big.
And it's largely going, unnoticed. Some people are complaining about it, but there's not been much pushback. So we are hoping that this will be a significant legal case if we were to win, and we're pursuing other legal options as well. Because I think it's important that these are fundamentally racist ideas, and if you're saying that you can't even challenge these ideas, then you are forcing a racist ideology onto someone, which is illegal, and it's an infringement of academic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of consciousness, because I'm being told how to think, essentially. That's what we're doing. So I'm crowdfunding for legal fees at the moment. It's going to cost me an awful lot. My campaign is called Stand Up to Woke. So I'm on Twitter. My crowdfund is GoFundMe Stand Up to Woke. That's where we're at. And the Bad Law are helping me and giving me advice and support as we go along. So I've got a kind of long road ahead, but probably about another year and a half. I don't quite know exactly yet because it's still ongoing. But that's where we're at.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where are you in relation to the Tavistock? I mean, are you still registered as a student? Have they kicked you off the course? What happens to because you've had to pay fees, haven't you? So I mean, have you been reimbursed? What's going on in relation to that?
They stopped me from seeing one of my patients. They said that I was unsafe to see patients, and they said they were going to do an investigation into me. This was in April of this year, and none of that happened. They just seem to be making it up as they go along. They're not following any of their policies or procedures. There's a recent round I've made. There's a complaints investigations going on as it stands. They haven't officially kicked me off, but they've sort of tried, and I think...
So is the course going on at the moment, but you're just not part of it?
So I've completed the 2 years, but in order to qualify, I need to finish my clinical work with patients. Well, they stopped my work with patients, and they told me I was unsafe. And they were going to do an investigation. None of this was put to me in writing. They were going to do an investigation into me. They didn't do that. So I'm now waiting to see. Everything takes an awful long time. So I'm still left in the lurch, not knowing what's happening to my qualification, not knowing what the next steps are. So it's...
But you have documentation. I mean, you have.
Yes.
And presumably you also have the material they sent to the nursing and midwifery council. So I mean, presumably that's, hugely significant stuff. I would have thought.
Yes, exactly. I mean, they recently sent. I've got 2 complaints going on, but they've upheld part of my complaint. We've got that back recently, so they have admitted they've done something wrong. In terms of my work with patients, I've been fine. I've got all my progress reports have said that I'm competent, but the issue is my wrong think, that I don't have the right views. That's
well, I hope you're going to be addressing that in the months and years to come.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we can get them to address.
Yes, well, that's what I'd like
their lack of, professional self-discipline, and that we give them something to think about.
Well,
before
hopefully
campaign.
this legal case will get them to undergo what Freud referred to as reality testing, to actually be faced with the reality of what they've done and the reality of the law, because they are acting like...
Well, that's like a cross to a vampire for a postmodernist. So
yes, the law is the law.
Yes, objective reality is objective reality.
Yeah, and evidence is evidence.
Yeah.
So,
Well, a very good note on which to end. Amy Gallagher, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for watching. And if you're in agreement with what Amy's trying to do, please support her through the Bad Law Project. Thank you.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.